The musicians of the National Arts Centre Orchestra and I are very grateful to live and work on the unceded traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Nous sommes touchés par l'hospitalité et la générosité des peuples autochtones de l'ensemble de ce grand territoire. Nous sommes accueillis et soutenus dans l'amitié et la collaboration par les communautés, les artistes interprètes, les compositeurs et les créateurs autochtones. And we will continue to build on those, honor those, and play an active role in truth and reconciliation. Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this episode of Musically Speaking. My name's Alexander Shelley, and I'm the Music Director of Canada's National Arts Centre Orchestra. For those of you returning to the series, thank you for joining us again. And to those of you who are tuning in for the first time, a very warm welcome to you. Great to have you with us. Over the course of the last 12 months or so, we've hosted a stellar list of guests from in and around the world of music, whether it was violin greats such as James Ennis or Daniel Hope, Indigenous singer-songwriter Jeremy Dutcher, diva extraordinaire Misha Brugger-Gossman, pianist Jan Leszecki, or for example, Canada's former Governor-General Julie Payette. We've had many wide-ranging and in-depth conversations about music. You can find all of these episodes and many more by visiting the NAC website and looking for Musically Speaking. In our most recent episodes, there has very much been a focus on creative artists. I've spoken with composers Ian Cusson, Gerard Tate, Vivian Fung, and most recently with Gabriela Montero and Stuart Goodyear, both of whom are improviser, composer, soloists. And today's guest is very much a continuation of this exploration of the theme of creativity. I'm thrilled, genuinely thrilled to be welcoming an artist of such breadth of interest and of such breadth of knowledge and talent. He's a JUNO and multi-award winning composer, pianist, conductor, who was described by the New York Times as exuberantly creative, which I think is a lovely two-word quote, and by the Toronto Star as an artist who reflects a positive vision of our cultural future, which is also something so important nowadays, positivity and optimism, I find, in the conversations we're having. He is the only artist to have served both as conductor in residence and composer in residence of a Canadian orchestra, and is building and has built what I find to be a truly fascinating career as pianist, composer, and conductor, with commissioned works for some of the most interesting artists of our time and performances at some of the most important venues. In addition to all of that, as of July 1st, he's also Professor of Orchestral Studies here in Canada's capital at uOttawa. And what an addition to the arts community here he is. A very, very warm welcome to you, Dinuk Wijeratne.
Alexander, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So where are you speaking to us from? Let's start with the basics on Zoom etiquette. Like, where are you at the moment?
I'm speaking to you from my home in Pickering, Ontario,
okay.
which is only my home for another 2 months. Because we're moving to Ottawa. Actually, we found a lovely house in Nepean, so we're moving in late August.
Oh, what great news. I know you were planning to move, but that's fantastic that you found somewhere. Congratulations. And so, new role, Director of Orchestral Studies. What are you looking forward to most in that role?
Gosh, I don't know. I'm sort of like part excited and part terrified in equal measure. And I think, I'm just sort of going to feel it out organically, but I guess, I'd love to be able to resonate with my community, energize the students, I hope, have some discussions about where they want to take their careers and so on.
And for viewers and listeners who aren't quite sure what orchestral studies are, can you give your definition? I suppose it could be broad, what do you define it as?
Well, I mean, primarily I'll be conducting the orchestra and programming the concerts, but they also know that I'm a composer too, and I think I'll get a chance to teach some composition as well. So yeah, I mean, I think there's some latitude to interact with the students in different ways.
And will you also be working with instrumentalists, orchestral musicians on the skill set involved in becoming a 21st century orchestral musician? Is that part of it as well?
Absolutely. And I think, discussions about what that is are very important.
Yeah. Well, I think, I hope very much, and I can see already in alignment, there's something we talk about constantly with our education work as an orchestra is how can we help be advocates for the orchestra of this century and what's coming ahead of us, because something I'd like to dig into in this conversation is how challenges for orchestral musicians have evolved over the last 100 years, let's say. I think, it's ever evolving and ever changing. And I think it's so refreshing and interesting to always ask oneself, okay, what skills do I need? Because, just being able to sight read and play your instrument in tune is not it anymore. That's a given. But we'll dig into that. Just also by way perhaps of sort of a biographical introduction to our viewers and listeners who don't necessarily know you very well yet. You have such an interesting journey already behind you in life. And I was wondering if you could sketch your points of call. Born in Sri Lanka, your home is here, but you've traveled. Can you tell us a little bit?
Absolutely. In a sense that, I've moved through my life from east to west. I was born in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, I didn't get to grow up there. We went there for holidays and that kind of thing. But I grew up in the Middle East, in Dubai. So I grew up, we moved there when I was 4. My family, like many Asians, started to work in Dubai. The country grew very, very quickly. So I was there until the age of 18. And it was an incredible childhood because it still is an incredible melting pot of culture. And so I was actually being trained as a Western classical musician, but around me were the sounds of Indian classical music because there were so many, half of my friends were from the Indian subcontinent, then the other half of my friends were British. Of course, you're in a Middle Eastern country, so Arabic music was all around me. And then, since I knew I wanted to be a musician, at the time you couldn't study higher education in music, so I moved to the UK. I went to the Royal Northern College for a great 5 years. It was wonderful to be in Manchester. And then I met John Corigliano there, actually in Manchester. He was getting a honorary doctorate, I think. And then he invited me to go to New York. So I was there for 4 years. And then I got the job with Symphony Nova Scotia. So I moved from, downtown New York City to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where I was walking New York style on the streets and cutting everyone up, and then I just absolutely fell in love with Nova Scotia. I have such amazing ties. I think I probably feel like Nova Scotia is still home, but now Canada is home, and so
we're going to do our best in Ottawa to make sure that this feels like home very fast, I think.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So you refer to learning music and learning Western classical music as a young boy or a young man in Dubai. How did music come into your life then? Is this through your family? Was it through
Yeah, absolutely. My mum is actually a retired ballet a dancer and teacher. So essentially, she was studying, Western ballet, and my father, he doesn't read music, but he plays a pretty mean jazz piano.
Really?
And so they had recordings around the house. And curiously, I actually started learning. My first instrument was an Indian mirdangam, which is a drum from the south. And then because one of my mom's friends was teaching piano, and I started with her, I think we decided, I would pick one instrument. And I actually didn't like the piano for a good 3 years until I had a sense of the context of the instrument in the history of Western culture. I started learning about the composers, their lives, and what they were trying to solve creatively. And then, at 12 years old, I heard a Mozart piano concerto, and that was it. I just thought that was, you know what it's like. You hear, it's almost like a spiritual experience, and you go, well, that's it.
That's beautiful. It's interesting to hear you speak about this. I remember growing up, one of my favorite books, and still one of my favorite books, is Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. And of course, you figure out very fast that history of Western philosophy is a history of philosophy as it also was transported to the West through from the East, right? And music, it's a whole other, we could speak for hours about it, and I'd love to we must do that one day. But the story of how actually many of the modes and scales, if not all of them, in Western classical music originated in the subcontinent, that in fact there's not this kind of there existed this and there existed that, and never did the two meet. But in fact, again, it's this sort of evolution of just like with mathematics, Pythagoras going and traveling and learning and listening. So that's a whole area that you sort of embody as a musician. And again, I can't wait to dig into it. But I think it's very interesting for our audiences always to remind themselves of that fact. We tend to put things in these little comfortable pigeonholes. But I think one of the great beauties of the world that we inhabit in classical music and symphonic music is that it is actually so borderless. And if one can revel in the fluidity, it's all the more special. But
absolutely, and I think it's wonderful when all of us are blessed in different ways to have an extra perspective through which to see something we know more intimately, shall we say. So for instance, if I'm accustomed to working with a Western classical orchestra, but I can still see it from the perspective of another musical culture, then it makes me a bit richer, Absolutely. And likewise, if I can see composition from the perspective as an improviser or vice versa. So I think, there's a virtue in sort of broadening our horizons always.
Absolutely. So I wanted to dig in all of that in a short while. I want to do something though with you, which is just a quick fire round of questions. I tend to do this on all of these musically speakings, and it kind of touches on some of the things we've spoken on already, but it's like a one-word answer.
Okay.
If you're comfortable doing that. So let's give it a go, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Okay.
I'm not the best at one-word answers, but I'll do my best.
Okay.
Okay.
Silence or sound?
See, I told you this is oh my gosh, a combination.
Okay, this is going to be tough.
Okay.
Smell or touch?
Touch.
Rhythm or harmony?
Rhythm.
Thought you'd say that. Rhythm or melody?
Rhythm.
Thought you'd say that too, because kind of without rhythm, neither of those can exist anyway. Head or heart? And don't say, let me think about that. Oh, good. Beatles or Boulez?
Beatles.
Chamber or symphonic?
Chamber. I think probably because symphonic is chamber, but that's something we can discuss later.
Absolutely. Dreams or reality?
Dreams.
Home comforts or hotel hospitality?
Home comforts.
Louvre or Alps?
Alps.
Revolutionary or incrementalist?
Incrementalist.
Globalism or localism?
Globalism.
Karl Marx or Adam Smith?
Karl Marx. Popular
success or the admiration of your peers?
Admiration of peers.
Hockey or cricket?
Cricket.
Dutch master or graffiti artist?
Oh, graffiti artist.
Cordon bleu or burger? It's kind of the same question. But...
Cordon bleu, I think.
Okay. Venice or Venice Beach?
Venice.
Venice or Vienna?
Venice.
If you had to live in 1920 or 2020, which would you choose?
1920.
Deadlines or freedom?
Freedom.
Which is more fulfilling, the process or the outcome?
The process.
Okay. Listen or talk?
Listen.
Michael Jackson or Michael Jordan?
Michael Jackson.
Michael Jackson or Jackson Pollock?
Michael Jackson.
Okay. Michael Jackson or Michelangelo?
Michael Jackson.
Love it. Inspiration or craftsmanship?
Oh gosh. Inspiration.
Bach or Britten?
Bach.
Bach or Bartok?
Bartok.
Bartok or Beethoven?
Bartok.
Interesting. Wow. Monteverdi or Mozart?
Mozart.
Mozart or Mendelssohn?
Mozart.
Mozart or Mahler?
Mozart.
So Bartok or Mozart?
Mozart.
Which book would you take to a desert island? Or a movie?
I think maybe Calvino's Invisible Cities.
Ooh, wow. And if you only had one creature comfort on that island, what would it be?
some shade in order to read the book.
That's lateral thinking there. And if you could meet and talk to anyone in history, who would that be?
Assuming that I could communicate with them.
Yes.
Mozart, I think.
Oh.
Yeah.
Last question, and thank you for your patience. It's the beautiful answers you've given me. Thank you. What is music's greatest strength? And that's not a one-word answer.
No. Yeah. Its ability to balance dichotomies so that you can feel more comfortable than you do in real life.
So that you see, that answer tells me a lot about how you approach music. I find it, because it's interesting. That speaks very much to me too. So
you know why and that's why some of your questions were so impossibly difficult, because you know, when you have to choose between freedom and structure, that's something that music allows you to balance, right? Because it's so difficult to balance and choose in everyday life.
And that's why, I mean, all of them were asked, you know, with that deliberate purpose in mind. You don't have to choose between Marx and Smith. They both had great concepts.
And mind and heart. You know, you're just trying to achieve that perfect balance in any given musical moment.
Yeah.
Between mind.
Well, I was mentioning to you before we came on air that one of the privileges for me of doing this series is that I need to then spend the time. I have to spend the time inhabiting what I can find about you online and in the world. And I've watched many and read many hours of you writing about things, talking with friends about things. I've listened to many hours of your music, and I enjoyed very much a podcast, a video podcast you did with Nick Halley, where you talk about balancing tradition and innovation. And again, for me, one of the frustrations in life has been that I think people in artistic life, observations, is that sometimes when people recognize that a great work was innovative, therefore it must be great, they think, well, therefore innovation is always good, which is this kind of leap, which isn't necessarily, you then get the idea that newness and novelty is inherently something that is then going to make something great. Whereas I think musicians often recognize that from a deep knowledge of tradition and a playing with structures and formality, sometimes, just sometimes, something naturally evolves that then breaks those barriers and opens up new pathways. And I get the sense from your conversation with Nick, which I would recommend to anybody who's watching this, that you feel similarly. Is that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
no, and absolutely. And one of your questions, which one was it? Incrementalism versus what else?
Revolutionary. Yeah, incrementalist versus revolutionary.
That made me think, because personally, I don't think I believe in innovation for the sake of innovation. So for instance, if you're creating something, I think, you know, if you're striving to be innovative in itself, it's a lot of pressure, right? And you could even argue that in art, everything has been done. You get people who say that, right? Yep. So then what do? I think if you work to represent yourself authentically in a very incremental way, if you are truly yourself, by that very nature, you will be innovative. Mm-hmm. And a lot of innovation happens simply because novel things are intersecting. Mm-hmm. So my perspective as person X looking at situation Y, mm-hmm. If I can create a sort of authentic intersection, creatively speaking, mm-hmm. the product is going to be innovative in some way.
Absolutely. I always ascribe it to Picasso, but I think I might be wrong, so apologies. But there's a quote that I believe is from him, which is that an artist spends their life trying to draw the perfect circle. It's the deviation from the circle that is their creativity. Mm-hmm. And I, as an interpretative artist rather than a creative artist, I find that a very useful description of interpretation, because mm-hmm. I do everything I can to try and understand and comprehend as much as I can about a score. And from that, without saying, what is Alexander Shelley's take on this, naturally a personal relationship and a personal take will evolve. So that is an example of something that I think can also be applied to the creative process. You're not necessarily saying, I am now going to change the world, but by being diligent and careful and thoughtful and precise, sometimes things can, those are not good words, by the way, but anyway, yeah.
No, that's beautiful. And you know, I actually, I love to debate with, if you were to call a musician an interpretive musician, if someone who considers themselves 100% an interpretive musician, if they say, well, I'm a servant of the composer, right? Because, I faithfully look at the text and I do my detective work and everything. It took being a composer to realize that I would happily challenge someone like that. I want that person to bring their personality into my work. So I think that colors how you do things interpretively too.
And this is, and you made there an interesting point, which is, though, that in my experience working with many, many different composers over the years, there are as many opinions on that as there are composers, right? So sometimes I'll study a score fastidiously, and I'll go into the rehearsal and I'll say to composer X, I'll say, do you really want this F sharp here? Because it doesn't fit with the rest. And they're like, yeah, F sharp or F natural, whatever you want. I'm like, no, please. Like, I have to believe that was just really important. And then there are others where they say, no, it has to be an F sharp. That was a terrible error. And there's everything in between. But I suppose that's the beauty of this. When you and I are working with orchestras, it's something that I always, you cannot but have it in your mind that when you're working with 60 or 100 brilliant musicians who've all done their 10,000 hours, who think very hard about what they do, of course there will be a range of opinions about every decision that's made there. There'll be people who say, when you meet a piece of music, just feel it, just go, just let it breathe like the air. And there's perfectly cogent arguments to be made for that. And then there's the other extreme, which is, it needs to be very analytical. So I suppose, like you said, one needs to sort of find oneself and understand how one can feel comfortable in one's skin when approaching music like that.
I think so, and Barenboim has this amazing way of explaining that process. He says, when you first encounter anything, any text, anything you have to study and realize, your first human reaction is gut instinct. Right? You react to it purely in this sort of instinctive way. And I can say both as a conductor and a composer, it's so valuable that time, even if it lasts a few seconds, your reaction before your intellect kicks in, you must find a way to record that. I certainly do if I'm creating a piece and I'm studying influences. I just make little notes and I just kind of record that moment and that opinion, because once your intellect kicks in, it might censor those very human reactions.
I find that fascinating because I recall I lived my life as a cellist and a pianist. That's how I grew up, and I studied cello. And growing up in the UK, there's a premium on sight reading, so I was very good at just put music in front of me and I'd sight read it, and it was all gut and instinct. When I used to, everyone composes when they're 18. I used to compose, but then when I really started to work on the craft of conducting, I completely changed that. So I would always prepare scores at a table. I still do. I don't play it at a piano, and I found that my relationship to music changed fundamentally. I thought and behaved far more structurally and, if you will, intellectually. But there's an assumption in what you say, which I find very, and I might be making a leap though. The intellect recognizes shapes and patterns, which, so I want to just distinguish between an emotional gut reaction, let's say, and an intellectual gut reaction, because sometimes your intellect can analyze and comprehend things that your slow brain then takes a couple of days or months to actually catch up with. But it's still a cerebral process. So recognizing the structures within a piece. And the other thing I'd like to sort of pick up on with you there is that the division between the intellectual, the structural, the cerebral, and the emotional content of music, I think is a false one. I think it's a little bit of a blind alley. So I think what you're talking about there is very interesting. When we're talking about gut, are we talking about emotion, or are we talking about intellectual gut, or both?
No, I guess I'm just talking about emotion and instinct.
Right.
Then I guess what you do is, when you do your sort of analysis, when you study a piece of music, you put that aside because you want to sort of exercise your intellect. You want to do all of your detective work. And let me just see if I can remember the Barenboim phrase, but he says, you're trying to get eventually to a place of, quote, conscious naivete.
Yes.
Where you can balance all of the stuff you've studied and then eventually let it go.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you're trying to do is, whether you're creating or interpreting, you're trying to achieve that perfect balance between mind and heart.
I agree.
Yeah, and that's a mistake.
Areas where, again, perhaps for our listening and viewing audience, let me give a concrete example. If you take the opening 4 notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, you might not think about it as a listener, but you have an immediate question that you could ask yourself there as a performer. Is it a heavy bar to a light bar, or is it a pickup bar to a heavy bar? So is it ba 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 b, or is it ba 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 b, right? Is it going to the next bar, away from it? Now, that I'm describing using words, and I'm analyzing it because I'm describing heavy light, and there are a lot of presumptions there about like weighting of bars and things like that. But when you look at that on the page, or you play it on the piano, if I say play that from your gut, you could do a whole lot of things that could all be from your gut, and none of them is more or less right. That's why we experiment with things as an instrument. So then, just to give a description of the thing that you were describing, the process then for a musician is to say, okay, well, I could do this, I could do that, I could do it fast, I could do it slow, but what role do those 3 notes play? Are they a pickup? Are they not? Or are they deliberately ambiguous? But first of all, you sort of need to dig into it if you want to do it authentically and solve that conundrum. And one of the beauties of Beethoven's music is that invariably, if something's questionable at the beginning and you're like, I don't know what that is, he will give you an answer later on in the movement that makes me, like, when I was first studying the symphonies properly, my hair would stand on end. I'm like, thank you, Beethoven, for solving that. And that's a beautiful thing. And so for me, they're really inextricably linked. And I get this idea that, don't lose instinct, but instincts can be wrong in a lot of things, politically, relationships, music, language. We can get a lot of things wrong.
Of course, I think the key is how you balance that with the intellect, and you shouldn't be willing to let one go at the priority of the other, right? And there are a lot of music education systems which have, in time, placed pressure on people to say, let go of the instinct, for example, or be more instinctive than intellectual or something. Mm-hmm. I think rather the virtue is the time you spend in considering all of your options. That first gut response I had, could I have been right? Could I have been wrong? And then these intellectual choices I've made.
Yeah.
Could I still be right, or could I still be wrong? And could I find a marriage of, where I am in this process with everything I've studied?
I agree. But I suppose ultimately what I'm describing is that it's the path that then Barenboim also describes, is that you ultimately want to get to a place, whether it's music or anything else, where you have the ability to alter your behavior and your emotional response to things through a seamless connection with then your analytical mind, such that perhaps the ideal state is where the two are constantly in this chain reaction, so that
absolutely
that we have this tendency in everything that we do to separate emotion and the thinking mind. And I'm just not sure that's I see why it's helpful analytically, but I'm not sure it's super healthy, because it's perhaps a false distinction and there's more connections than we can perhaps comprehend. Anyway, yeah. So listen.
I think that's just one of the dichotomies that's important to us, and there are so many others. I think, discipline and freedom is another big one. Tradition and innovation is another huge one. I think, we're blessed to have a medium that allows us to find a sense of balance when we can't easily find that in our daily lives.
But again, some individuals and some characters will seek balance. It's so interesting that's the thing that you pick up, is that it offers us the ability to find balance. Whereas there are other personalities that would say, I actually, in music and in art, I don't seek balance. I seek extremes. So already there, the words we use to describe what we're searching for are very interesting. But I'm going to take one step back and ask you, as someone who has so many different hats, you're a very rounded musician, which is in this great tradition of so many of the composers that we idolize from centuries before, they were performing, improvising musicians. Do you, when you play the piano, when you are in front of an orchestra, would you nowadays say that that is primarily as a vehicle to articulate your music, or does the act of interpreting draw you equally, other people's music?
I mean, I have to say, Alexander, hand on heart, I think of myself as a composer first.
Yeah.
So I guess, as soon as I get out of bed, I'm thinking about what I might be able to create, right? Mm. And usually there's a piece on the go, of course. Mm-hmm. And there's often more than one. So I'm thinking about that. But when I take apart a score that of someone else's, I think at this point in life also, I'm trying to find what my connection to it is, what I might be able to say. Not that I'm trying to kind of force that through, but I just think, well, maybe that's what will make my interpretation a little different if I can bring something to it. But, of course, you really feel your way through that process.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to play for our audience just a few minutes of you doing all of it. So playing the piano, directing an orchestra, and playing some of your own music. This is from April, I believe, of this year, yes, with Symphony Nova Scotia. Could you maybe say a couple of words about the context of this performance we're going to hear?
Absolutely. I've had a long and wonderful association with Symphony Nova Scotia. They feel like family. This piece was actually a co-commission from the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra and eMusici. And then we decided to record it in Symphony Nova Scotia. And it is a celebration of a dance form, a traditional dance form from Sri Lanka called Vannama. And there are several Vannam, and the most famous, where the melody is actually very much in the public consciousness, is the Gajaga Vannama, which is the elephant Vannam. The elephant is this sort of is a sacred animal. It's majestic, and so this piece is a sort of celebration of that tribute to the elephant, with also a tribute to dance and drumming in Sri Lanka.
Beautiful. Well, Greg, would you be so kind as to roll a little bit of the tape then, please? Oh, so I would suggest that if possible, we post a link to that on below this conversation so that our audience can listen to the rest. It's such a great piece, and I want us to do it here at the NAC, and I can't wait for it to happen with you.
And I want to promise that the elephant does eventually move faster than that.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, I spent ages trying to figure out which section we could play, and you know, ultimately I just thought, okay, let's start there and give a little snippet, because later on you pick up a microphone and you're, is singing the right word to use?
It's more like a sort of recitation.
Yeah, it's a recitation. It's a very rhythmic recitation that comes later. But in that section alone, you know, we hear South Asian melody, rhythm, we hear jazz chords and jazz scales, we hear extended instrumental techniques. All of what you described about your life and your journey is in those few minutes. Can I ask you, do you have a sense of home in terms of a style or a musical language, or is that far too simplistic?
You know, actually what I've discovered, Alexander, is that the question of home is extremely complex.
Mm.
And I say that because, so, you know, I have this clarinet concerto. It's written for the wonderful Kinan Azmi. And he and I, just because we've been touring for years since we were students, our sort of recital program is about this question of home. You know, how do people define home? And so when I decided to write the concerto for him, I suggested, why don't we make the whole concerto about this question? And so, you know, it led to a very deep discussion about how we define it. Different people have all kinds of definitions, and I guess I have mine. And what amazed me was that when you pose this question to the audience, people will listen to the music and they will just come up to you and want to tell you about what home means to them. You know, is it something that's defined by geography? Is it defined by the people you're associated with? Is it a place you feel compelled to contribute to in some way? Or, you know, in the case of, I guess my definition would be, you know, it's actually a window in time because there's something very ephemeral about it. So, for example, when I think of my childhood in Dubai, it was, I mean, that city has grown so rapidly that that window in time, which I considered home, is no longer available, right? So home is also defined by some kind of time period, which is kind of bizarre too.
Mm. I agree with everything you've said, and I find that a very interesting conundrum when it comes to engagement nowadays with the question of identity, because too often, for my liking, when we identify people by a couple of quite simple, like, well, where did they originally come from, or, you know, where do they live now, therefore they must be this or this. You know, every single individual in the world understands that describing oneself, or even thinking about one's own identity, is like a moment that you take, right? You don't walk around thinking about your own identity the whole time. It's more when someone poses a question of what is home that you think, that's a very interesting question. And time, I find, is also a metric that we don't talk about so much. When we talk, I mentioned in a conversation a few weeks ago with Stuart Goodyear and Gabriella, that if I think about, let's say, a man born in London like I was, from 1780, I am certain that I have far more in common with you, who's born in Sri Lanka and brought up in Dubai, because of the virtue of the fact of the time we live in and the connectivity of the world. You know, so even though on paper I come from the same place as that person, I don't think I would have very much to talk to him or her about at all. So yeah, time and this sort of ephemeral nature of a home and self is also fascinating. But I wanted to ask about your creative process as well. So we see you at the piano there. Do you generally compose at an instrument?
No, to be honest, I think I enjoy very much sort of this first stage of thinking purely conceptually. And
is that in the broadest sense?
In the broadest sense.
What story am I telling, or what do I want to express? Or
absolutely, because, you know, I mean, more as I get older, I'm so convinced every piece is an opportunity to tell a story. Even if the audience doesn't know what the story is, right? So even all these abstract pieces like a Beethoven symphony, we don't have any program notes for Beethoven 5. But in order for me to conduct it personally, I just think, okay, this is the journey from darkness to light in 35 minutes, right? And I could be completely wrong. Maybe he had a different sort of, what do you call it? It's basically one of those kind of pitch, this sort of pitch sentences that you define a movie by or something, right? But maybe he had something different, but that allows me to sort of navigate my way through it. Yeah. So in terms of the pieces I'm writing, I'm just thinking, what is its message? What is it trying to say? And I spend a huge amount of time, like weeks or months, just thinking about those things before you've even talked about writing an F or an F sharp or something. So really it goes from a very sort of conceptual point of view and then to detail.
So I loved that you did that with, now remind me the name, is 2 pop songs on Antique
Poems.
Yeah, because that's a beautiful concept of what you did there. You took the poetry, you set the words, but then you stripped away the words.
Yes.
Which I think is, again, for listeners, like a really clear demonstration of actually what you mean is that there is a narrative, there is something in mind, and you constructed the music around it, but then you tore away the sort of tangible narrative to leave then the expressive content. And I that leads me to a sort of area that I think about a lot, and I'd love to actually spend, I think in a way I do spend my life exploring it, but that when we look across cultures and across time, you see archetypes in storytelling that, even though they manifest themselves in different ways, they're the same archetypes, right? Because in essence, humans ask themselves the same question. Always.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And we tend to then in stories find the words, and maybe it's the wolf, maybe it's the sun, maybe it's the moon, maybe it's lots of different things, but we recognize those archetypes when we look across. And I find it very interesting to ask myself the question whether those archetypes exist at the next level down, which is so in pure emotion, which then music can evoke, and whether in fact we spend our lives telling those same stories, but using musical archetypes and musical memes. And that seems to me like a very fruitful area also for research and thought, because a lot has been put into actual word stories, but I think musical stories may have the same recognizable parts. And when I read about and listened to the way that you went about writing those songs, I was very moved by it. I thought it was a very beautiful, beautiful idea.
And I think every artist, what I find fascinated by is as you get to know an artist's work over time, their lens, the lens through which they look at the world, becomes increasingly clear. You know, and I love, like, I mean, not just artists, like just meeting people, anyone. For coffee or something. I guess I love to get to that point in the, when you ask each other questions and you're getting to know someone else. How do you see the world? Because then if you're creating anything, you're going to be creating something because you're looking through this lens,
And how consistent is that? Like, there are mornings I wake up and I see the world and I'm like, blue. And then, you'll have a week later and a lot of stuff's happening, you haven't slept very well or whatever, and then you see the world as purple. And I'm using that as a sort of shorthand for one's moods and emotions and relationship to the world and what one emphasizes. And that's also, I find, a takeaway in life, that the assumption that someone sees the world through a lens.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I say that,
I understood. I'm sorry.
I mean, I think there's something quite fundamental. It manifests in slightly different ways. We're interested in a few different core values, shall we say. It's not a large amount, actually, because then you're really trying to choose between belief systems, right? But one example for me is, having lived the life I've lived, on any given day, I never feel fully Eastern or never feel fully Western, right? Chances are that's never going to change. So it's no surprise then if I'm trying to create music, I'm interested in the meeting of cultures and what happens when they sort of rub up against each other. And I'm looking for some kind of sense of balance that I can't find that way.
Yeah, interesting. And yet, obviously, by virtue of the words that you chose, the concept of Western and the concept of Eastern are defined poles for you.
I think so.
They're clearly defined poles, yeah.
I think so. I think you're looking for similarities. You're looking at differences. The differences are fascinating. You try to reconcile them. And, you know, so I mentioned that kind of East-West lens, or rather, shall we say, the cultural interplay lens.
Yes.
That would be one of a couple. You know, the other is this, I love this conflict between composition and improvisation. Because that is essentially whatever is premeditated versus whatever is completely spontaneous. And you can have so much fun when they just collide, right?
So this is an area I sort of unpacked a little bit with Gabriella Montero and Stuart Goodyear a couple of weeks ago, and I find fascinating as a dilettante jazz pianist that I've been for decades. I find it very interesting to ask myself where the line is between pastiche and a crude knowledge of styles and improvisation. And I think people put that line in different places. I'm brutally conscious sometimes that a pattern that I played, a sound, is something I created, is simply also related to how my fingers feel comfortable on the keys, and therefore my ear starts getting used to me going that direction, or that I heard a lick somewhere and I tend to like do, you know. So the word improvisation is a fascinating one to me, because pure unencumbered improvisation is almost impossible. Just like in a language, we are governed by the rules of the language and our knowledge of that language. And so I suppose it leads to the question that you touched on with the quote from Barenboim, is should one be on a never-ending search for knowledge in order to free oneself up more to improvise?
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah, because that's what my feeling is in life. Like as a pianist, if I could just absorb every piece of information about scales and feel and mood and harmony and everything else, then I'd feel, ironically, freer. You know, less information hems you in. But I guess, I'm sorry I'm talking about this a lot, but it fascinates me because when we say that there's improvisation here and then there's sort of the act of writing down pieces of music, I think there are aspects actually of both that are more related than one thinks. Because again, when one improvises, one's using predetermined and pre-learned structures, unless one is utterly free. Where do you stand on it?
Yeah, and that's a beautiful way to put it. You know, I think the relationship will influence you whether you're interpreting text or you're actually improvising. So let me give you an example. You know, if I have a piece where that requires me to play something that's premeditated, so it's been written down, and then you go off on a tangent and you improvise and you come back or something, what you end up doing is you're trying the written down material. And so this would be the same if you were interpreting a Brahms symphony or something. You're trying to make the written down information sound as fresh as improvisation. And then when you start improvising, you're desperately trying to make the improvisation sound like it's so perfectly sculpted, I hope, that it could have been written down.
Yeah.
And on a good day, if you confuse the audience and they don't know where the line is, that's a good day. And
I think for listeners, you know, text or reciting a poem, for example, is a really good example. If someone says to you, stand up for 5 minutes, speak from the heart, but you need to recite this poem, then it's exactly the same challenge. It's like you want what you say from the heart to sound crafted and formed and well thought through, and you don't want to and ah. But when you recite the poetry, you want it to sound like it's just flowing out of you. So I think the way you've put that is very beautiful, and it's something that I think audiences can relate to, because in that excerpt that we played, you are improvising, I think, right? There are moments there where we move into the improvisational realm, or not?
Oh, actually, yes, a tiny bit. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was. Yeah.
My impression in that work is that there's a lot of structure, but then these pockets. And
absolutely. Yeah.
So we hear the musicians of Symphony Nova Scotia doing a wonderful job of playing alongside you, and we can hear, as we discussed, the stylistic demands that you're putting on them. How important is it for a 21st century musician to go beyond the ability to read notes well and kind of have fidelity to the text that's on that page, and to have inhabited those worlds? So would you say that it would be a virtue for a violinist in that orchestra to also have spent time with South Asian music, and or do you think that's not necessary?
That's an amazing question. I mean, I think, you know, the bottom line is it's a virtue to have spent time with anything else that's not in the immediate context. In the immediate context, you know, we have this incredible repertoire of Western classical music for orchestra. But now this is the year 2021, and it is an increasingly globalized world. Increasingly, it is also a world where technology is dominant. So I think, if we look at the history of the orchestra, as it's grown incredibly, I mean, if you look at the history of the Western classical orchestra since, let's say, Monteverdi, when someone had the idea to put instruments together, different instruments, right? If you plot a graph of, let's say, time against innovation, you will get this incredible like exponential curve to about Mahler, and then I'm thinking, what does the curve look like through the 20th century? Does it reflect the same growth as technology rapidly increased in the 20th century and the 21st century? I don't think so. You could argue that when orchestras became business models in the late 1800s, shall we say, we decided to sort of just kind of do what we knew would sell, right? And now I think people are very interested in whether orchestras are reflecting multicultural societies in which they are placed. Are they keeping it up to date with technology? I mean, I think the pandemic, as terrible as it has been, it was a good sort of kick in the pants to the orchestral industry to embrace digital technology and everything, and because we're consuming things like that now, and maybe now the future will be a sort of digital acoustic hybrid.
Yeah, I think you made very interesting points there, and I think the relationship is not just to technology, but also very closely to politics and the reigning feel and philosophy of the time. So that graph does go just beyond Mahler, of course. It goes to Rite of Spring and Firebird and Petrushka, and what you hit then, and with late Elgar and so on and so forth, what you hit then is the First World War. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is an argument to be made that those 4 years changed relationship to those colossal romantic expressions of something. Mm-hmm. And the 20s were really a different world artistically. Mm-hmm. And yes, technology, but I think also yes, politics, I think yes, cultural shifts and mood. And it's going to be interesting how also this time affects that, because I agree with what you've been saying.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I'm not saying that nothing innovative happened, not at all. I think the question is, because of course we have amazing pieces that were written during these centuries and even in the last few years. The question is, are we out of step in some way if science, tech, and business have made innovations mm-hmm. and we haven't been innovating at the same rate? Mm-hmm. I think that's worth asking.
Yeah, and I suppose it's also what metrics are we using, because it's sort of a little bit apples and oranges. It's quite difficult to compare certain mm-hmm. aspects of that. But I think what you say about an orchestra reflecting the society in which it's embedded mm-hmm. is a very interesting principle. And as a musician who's in the year before the pandemic, I was on 6 different continents working with orchestras and looking at audiences. And one thing I recognize is that there is no one type of audience for a symphony orchestra. It's incredibly varied wherever you go. I remember going down to Venezuela to Simon Bolivar Orchestra in the late noughties and early teens, and average age can't be much more than 35 of audience. And then you go between 2 halls in Berlin and you'll see an older audience here, a younger audience here. And it's so much about this messaging, about what one wants to, how one wants to enter into dialogue and communicate. But one of the other many reasons that I think you're just so inspiring and exciting is that you for me marry up both of these aspects, that you are, you're embedded in tradition, you have a huge amount of knowledge, and you have a huge amount of freedom through your skills in improvising that have been accrued and built. But you're also a manifestation of that outward looking and sort of positive relationship between our music and the world of today. So I realize I've just written like an epitaph at the end, and we've got 4 minutes left. So that's maybe a perfect moment to also just thank you, Dinuk. I hope that this is the first of several such conversations. I know it's the first in private. We'll talk much over drinks and food in private now in Ottawa, but I hope that we could also use a forum like this again, because you are such an interesting and compelling individual. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And to our listening audience, thank you for being with us. If you want to watch this interview again, you can go to the NAC website, where it will live for a while, and all of the other musically speaking conversations that I've had over the last 12 months. I can highly recommend a visit to Dinuk's website. Either just Google his name or go to www.dinukwijeratne.com, and there's a huge amount of great content in there, blogs, music, his thoughts. It's just a great website. And come and visit here in Ottawa to see him working live at the university as well. On July 19th, there is the next Musically Speaking, hosted by Vicky Tremblay of the Université de Montréal, with guest Jean-Luc Terrien, a 2020 CBC 30 under 30 pianist, and Alain Trudel, trombonist and former principal youth and family conductor of the NAC Orchestra. He's now music director, of course, of Orchestra Symphonique de Laval. And they will be talking about the music of Jacques Etu in that episode, so it should be really, really interesting. And finally, the NAC Orchestra looks forward to welcoming you back into our hall in the new season. Let's all keep fingers, toes, noses crossed, but it looks like we're going to be able to be with you in person, and in the coming weeks we're going to be announcing our season, which is really full of wonderful, wonderful music. Between now and then, please stay safe, look after yourselves. Thank you for being with us, and see you very soon.